We shall never surrender.
One small step for man.
I have a dream.
Those who do not know real quotes are condemned to repeat bogus quotes. Let's join Professor Buzzkill for Quote or No Quote.
Yes, it's Professor Buzzkill here, and you know I'm a romantic at heart. And apart from seeing the sunlight glinting through Lady Buzzkill's golden tresses, the thing I like best in this world is hearing from you, dear listeners. And I've certainly heard from a lot of you recently. We did a Woman Crush Wednesday show on the great Chinese revolutionary writer Zhou Jin. And I ended that episode wondering whether her life showed that the pen was indeed mightier than the sword. Many of you wrote in asking me to trace that very phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword, for a quote or no quote episode. Was it Shakespeare? Voltaire? Thomas Jefferson? Some of you said you've even seen it attributed to Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, and of course, that famous magnet for all quotations, Winston Churchill. Well, despite the fact that the phrase adorns one of the walls at the Thomas Jefferson building at the Library of Congress, and even though Winston Churchill's facility with the pen was indeed mightier than his sword-wielding in battle, it originates with neither one. It's not Shakespeare's, nor Voltaire's either, at least not those exact words in that exact order. The pen is mightier than the sword sprang first from the English writer and politician Edward Bulwer Lytton, who lived in the first half of the 19th century and is also responsible for the phrases "the great unwashed" and "pursuit of the almighty dollar." Now, believe it or not, he also wrote the famous opening line, "It was a dark and stormy night," which, as you know, has been mocked and parodied ever since. In 1839, Bulwer Lytton published a play about Cardinal Richelieu, the powerful 17th century French bishop and politician. The play wasn't all that historically accurate, but it did include Richelieu musing about the nature and fragility of political power. In Act 2, Scene 2, the cardinal says, "True this, beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword. Behold, the arch-enchanter's wand itself is nothing, but taking sorcery from the master's hand to paralyze the Caesars and to strike the loud earth breathless. Take away the sword. States can be saved without it." Now, the play itself was not among the 19th century most successful, but the line, "the pen is mightier than the sword," lived on. In fact, by the 1840s, just within a few years, that phrase was practically a cliche. And although the exact wording of "the pen is mightier than the sword" comes from him, the concept seems to be as old as human civilization. An ancient Assyrian philosopher wrote around 500 BC that, quote, "the word is mightier than the sword." The Old Testament's epistle to the Hebrews includes the phrase, "Indeed, as the word of God is living and effective, sharper than any two-edged sword." The basic idea occurs in other ancient and medieval literatures in the East and the West, and is used especially often in early modern literature, including Shakespeare. Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, includes the observation, "Many wearing rapiers are afraid of goose quills." By the 1620s, it was referred to as an old saying. Thomas Jefferson was known to use a variation of it in the early 1790s, and Napoleon Bonaparte famously wrote, quote, "4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets." Mormon pioneer Joseph Smith wrote in 1830 that the word had a greater tendency to lead people to do that which was just. Yea, it had more powerful effect upon the minds of the people than the sword. So the concept clearly has a history as long as human literature itself. But as a young buzzkiller, I was always under the impression that it had a purely pacifist meaning, that the written word was more effective at convincing people to do something right than the tip of a blade. That argument was always more effective than threats of bloodshed. As usual, however, I've been schooled by human nature and by the modern world that the pen can, and was, used as an awful instrument to promote violence. And as a grown-up over the last few decades, I've come to wonder and worry whether the pen that transcribed Jesus' Beatitudes in the New Testament was mightier than the one that wrote Mein Kampf. Was Martin Luther King's pen that wrote his I Have a Dream speech mightier than the racist weapons that struck down and killed so many civil rights protesters in our own time? Given how awful the 20th and 21st centuries have been in terms of bloodshed and killing, and given that people in prior centuries seem to have pushed the technological limits of their abilities to kill, it's difficult to come to an uplifting conclusion that the peace-loving pen is mightier than the violence-inducing sword. I'd like to think, however, that we can still try to make it so. Talk to you next week.